Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The show is about to begin.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Opinionated Podcast. If you didn't know, I'm your host, Luke Sharon, and I'm kind of opinionated. Today is the start of a new series. I'm going to call it the Commissioner Candidate Series. I just made that up. Don't quote me on that. I'll forget it. Today we interview the incumbent for District 2's seat for Commissioner, Fillios. Is that how you say it, Fillios?
Yes, sir. You got it right.
Awesome. Thank you for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. How's your day going, Mr. Fillios?
So far, fine. We have some issues to deal with, very specifically the passing away of our county assessor on Saturday morning. And so within 15 days, the Republican Central Committee will have to provide us county commissioners with 3 names, and we choose one. So it's, it's somewhat of a tragic start, but it is what it is. It's part of the job, and hope we'll get.
Well, sorry to hear about that. Well, today these questions are a bit different. Instead of me making most or all of the questions, we ask community members and people who work at the commissioner's office questions they had about or for the candidates. If you are ready, and if it's okay with you, let's get started.
I'm all set.
Okay. So the first topic is just the commissioner in general. How would you describe the job of commissioner, and what do you think a normal day would look like, or in this case, what do you do in a normal day, and what do you think the limits of your job are?
Okay. Wow.
I know it's
okay. So let me try to define the job. If I had to define the job in a nutshell, you might say that we are the agents for implementing policy, if you will, and practice for the state. And if I had to narrow that down, I'd say essentially health and safety and the collection of taxes. Now, there's a lot involved between those two. The job itself is obviously defined by the legislature. So everything we do is guided by law. We cannot just arbitrarily or capriciously make decisions, although some people will accuse us of that from time to time. The job itself, I tell people, imagine the federal government rolled into a body of 3 people. So essentially what that means is that we operate on 3 levels: administrative, legislative, and quasi-judicial. Administrative is organizational type issues, reassignment of personnel, dealing with those issues. We have, for example, 15 departments that report directly to the 3 of us, okay? Legislative would be an example of laws that we can pass, for example, speed limits on our waterways, or control, if you will, or for enforcement of the wake, things of that nature where we can pass legislation. And thirdly, quasi-judicial, and that's an area where we act as judges and we have to behave as judges. So for example, if a property owner comes before one zone, wants to change from one type of zone to another, so say from a 10-acre minimum to a 5-acre minimum on his, let's say, his or her 15-acre parcel, that's considered a quasi-judicial hearing. So we operate as judges. We take testimony. We are not permitted to go visit the site unless all 3 of us together in the same vehicle with a clerk recording the conversation. So we act as though we were in fact judges. So we operate on those 3 levels. Virtually every decision we make is a vote of 2 out of 3 of us. Not every decision, but most decisions. Some of the administrative essentially don't need to be. I'm currently acting as the chairman. I have no more authority than my 2 co-commissioners. The basic difference is that my job is to basically run the process, to make sure the meetings run smoothly, to set the tempo and some of the parameters for those meetings.
So what does that look like when you moderate one of those meetings?
Well, for example, if you take a public hearing, we have certain parameters that we have to follow, and essentially those parameters are to ensure that the applicant has due process and anybody else who is testifying. So let's say it's a public hearing for a zone change. We would take testimony from the public. An individual that's testifying would get, let's say, 3 minutes time. Or if that individual has 10 or more people who are willing to forfeit their time, that individual would get 15 minutes. And those individuals have to be present and agree to forfeit their time. And that's how we run a public hearing. A public meeting is very different. A public hearing is a participation sport, if you will. A public hearing, that is. A public meeting is a meeting really amongst the three of us and anybody else we choose to engage. And at the conclusion of that meeting, we will typically call for public comment. And people can comment typically on the subject of that particular meeting.
Has there been any like times where it's been like funny, like people between like arguments and you're just like, break it up, break it up?
Oh yeah, that happens from time to time. Typically not in a public hearing. Well, what might happen is people expressing their approval or disappointment. They might applaud, and I have to put a stop to that because it just takes up time and it's not fair for people who are following. Yeah, it does happen from time to time.
I see.
But essentially, that's our job. In terms of meetings, let's see, in 2017, we just happened to measure it. I had just over 400 board level meetings. That means with my other two commissioners, I had something like 30 or somewhere around the 30 or 35 range executive sessions. Those are sessions that are closed to the public, typically involving issues such as disciplinary action, real estate transactions, a potential lawsuit, things of that nature. Every meeting we have, except for the executive sessions, is open to the public. Okay, and we have to abide by the open meeting law. When we have executive session, we discuss, but we cannot make decisions in executive session. We come out of session, a motion is made, and the decision is made in an open meeting.
I see.
So in essence, that's the job. Where people go awry, if you will, in the understanding of our job, this is minimally political. I like to say that we touch people's lives on almost a daily basis.
Wow. So if it's minimally political, what does that mean, and and if it's minimally political, then why is this race partisan?
Wow, that's a good question. That's the decision that was made by the Idaho GOP, the Republican Party of the state of Idaho. I don't know what their reasoning is. I think some of it has to do with, trying to maintain, how do I put this? They're trying to maintain a certain philosophy, that comports with a more conservative outlook on things in general. That's the only way that I can speculate. Yeah, that's a question that I don't think I can answer. Should it be? Many would argue yes, some would argue no. I can tell you that when I make a decision, I don't make it on the basis of my party affiliation.
Thank you, and I appreciate that you don't do that, because I bet you there's some commissioners that do that. Okay, so the next question is, when you're an elected official, doing what you believe in will make some people happy, but others very angry, no matter what you do. For example, raising wages help keep good employees, but it would upset taxpayers. How does that affect the work that needs to be done?
Raising wages does not always upset taxpayers. Taxpayers get upset because their property taxes rise. You cannot always attach an increase in property taxes to an increase in wages. We have a situation in Kootenai County where over the last at least several years, there have been several wage studies conducted, and it was determined over that course of time, and it might be 4 years, 6 years, that on average, our employees were underpaid by 8 to 15%. As the economy continues to expand, at least up until the COVID situation, we had a labor shortage. We cannot afford to lose seasoned people. So what we did in this fiscal year, we made a decision that we were going to attempt to correct the deficiencies. Now, the latest wage study, which is the one that we acted upon, showed an average underpayment of about 8%. But I can tell you that we had certain individuals that were underpaid by as much as 40%. Now, clearly, we could
Wow.
not make that up in a single year. And so we embarked on a course to try to make us more competitive with other jurisdictions. And that decision was agreed upon by all 9 elected officials. We 3, as well as the other 6. And so now back to the question of taxation. It's very interesting because people assume that every decision or many of the decisions we make increases their property taxes. Not necessarily so. I can show you cases even this year where some people's county property taxes now have declined. Others have increased. Much of that has to do with 2 things. Number one, whether or not that particular property was part of a revaluation. By state law, 20% of the county gets reassessed every year. If you happen to be within that 20% in any given year, you might experience a tax increase, but likely you might not have in the previous 4 years, okay? The other option, the other possibility or explanation is that if those comparable properties that you're being compared to have risen substantially, which is the case, last year, I believe we had an overall county appreciation rate of at least 12%. Obviously, that's going to have an impact. So it isn't so much the budget. And I guess we can get to the question of taxation later, but that's the basic explanation. As far as how we rank as a county for taxation, I don't know if you want me to respond to that now or I can do that later. It's your call.
Well, I mean, why not just do it right now? Because
okay, basically, if you go on our website and you go on kcgov.us, go onto the landing page, click on performance indicators, and you're going to see a variety of indicators as to how we perform as a county. One of those indicators is the area of taxation. Of the 4 fastest growing counties in the state of Idaho, again, I'm talking about the county portion of people's property taxes. We are the lowest of the 4, and we are in the bottom third of counties for taxation overall, property taxation. As a state, Idaho ranks also in roughly the bottom third of property taxes on a nationwide basis. So overall, when people complain about their property taxes, I understand that, but I can only address the county component, which typically is 25% of a property owner's total tax bill. The other elements, like fire districts, highway districts, schools, we have no control over. So we are responsible for about 25% of the total tax bill. We collect taxes for everyone, and we distribute those among the other taxing districts.
do you think that the reason why people get irritated with you guys specifically just because of taxes is because people don't know your job?
Absolutely. Absolutely. People really don't understand. I can tell you that in this campaign, I get questions like, do you support the president? Where do I stand on the Second Amendment? Why is that relevant? That's not my job.
I agree.
That is not my job. And that should not be a litmus test. But for some people it is. And I do answer their questions. But again, I think they see us much in the same light as they would a legislator. When you send a legislator to Boise, that individual is going to advocate. Our job is not really advocacy, except maybe if we're dealing with, the legislative component that I described earlier.
Yeah.
And even there, we're still gathering testimony. So there you go.
Yeah. I bet you that gets annoying pretty fast. Yeah. I bet you that gets annoying.
It does. And some of it is our fault, but now that we have a communications manager, she's able to engage people on Facebook and other media where she can correct some of the misconceptions that exist out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what you guys need to be doing. So on to the next question. Right now, the county does not have a strategic plan. Do you think they should? And if no, why not? If yes, what would they put in it? Or what do you think they should put in it?
Okay. We do have a strategic plan from the standpoint of road infrastructure, and that's the Kootenai Metropolitan Planning Organization, KMPO, and there are roughly about a dozen entities that participate in that, and we are one. And that deals with a lot of the road infrastructure. So there is planning as far as that is concerned. Also realize that if we were to have a strategic plan, and let's say that plan were to address issues such as water or roads or fire, remember, they are their own districts. So how do we set up a strategic plan that affects those entities that we don't have any control over? The best way to understand county government or local government in the state of Idaho, it's divide and be conquered. Because by setting up and distributing government the way statute does in the state of Idaho, it makes strategic planning very, very difficult. Now, having said that, there's another issue. And I think I'll just recount a little experience that I had a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, when I went to the new commissioner orientation to accompany Leslie Duncan and Bill Brooks. I sat at a table with another county commissioner from another county. I think it might have been Leta, but I'm not sure. Introduced himself and he said, "Oh, you eat your own up there." His point was that we turn county commissioners over like water. And when you do that, how do you implement a strategic plan?
I see.
Now, somebody might say, and you could argue, maybe some of them deserve to be diselected or unelected. That's a point. But the fact is, it gets very difficult. Should there be a strategic plan? Yeah, there probably should be, but implementing it would be very, very difficult. And realize that we are basically conducting the day-to-day operations of the county. So I wouldn't call us CEOs, I would call us COOs, Chief Operating Officers. And so, yes. And by the way, I participated in strategic plans when I was in private industry, and some of them for a very large business segment, like the computers that we sold that supported the whole telecommunications network in the US. But that was private industry where everything came together at a CEO and he could set the strategic direction. And again, that individual, he or she could be in office for 8, 10, 15 years. Here, we could be turning over commissioners every 2, 4, or 6 years. So it becomes a challenge. Yeah, we should have one, but it would, the way we're currently organized, it would make it very difficult.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, which is just taxes in general. When is it, in your opinion, okay to raise taxpayers' taxes?
When you are growing at a rapid rate, and we are considered, depending on who you talk to, the 3rd or 5th fastest growing in the county. Excuse me, fastest growing county, the 3rd or 5th fastest growing in the nation.
Oh, goodness.
Okay, so last year, and I just saw some recent figures, I believe we absorbed some 4,700 new transplants, and our population is just over 165,000. What is happening is, as the population grows, the demands on the county are growing. And so when that occurs, obviously, we have to address that. Now, when you look at our population growth as compared to our employment growth, if we have population growing at 2.5%, but we have employment growth growing at just under 1%. So we are growing the employment base at a much slower rate than the population. If that's the case and the demands are being made, then a property tax increase may be in order. But remember, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get your taxes are going to increase. That's where we run into a misunderstanding. And let me also point one other thing out. If you take the total valuation of property in the county, total property valuation in the county is $20 billion with a B. The amount of money that we raised last year when we took the 3% tax increase, $1.4 million.
Oh, wow.
So what's 1.4 on a $20 billion total valuation?
Basically nothing.
Right. And again, we're capped at 3%. So we try to approach every budget from the standpoint of how we can minimize taxes. But when the various tax increases, if we can do zero, we'll do zero. This year, we've begun our fiscal 21 budget launch, trying to see if we can hold to a 0% tax increase. At this point, it's too early to tell whether or not we can accomplish that. But again, if we're growing employment at a far slower rate than the population growth as a whole, and those demands continue to increase, and we're operating as efficiently as we can, then we necessarily have to raise taxes. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to have a tax increase, because we're spreading out that increase over an increasingly growing base. And that's why it doesn't hit the individual taxpayer that heavily. Now, some people will say, well, wait a minute, my taxes, as somebody said to me the other day, my taxes went up $1,000 this year. Okay, now did you look at the other tax? Go back to your tax bill. Look at it. There are 44 taxing entities in Kootenai County. And depending on where you live, you're probably being taxed on maybe 5, 6, or 7 of those. Look at the tax bill, look at the first line item, Kootenai County, and then look at the rest, and especially pay attention to the schools. We do not control that. We only control the first line item. Hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you. This is just a random question that I had when you were talking, and I've been told this. Didn't you guys get a budget of 100 million? No, I could be wrong. 100 million this year? Wow.
101.6.
Wow. That is
1.6. Okay, right. And now I'll anticipate the rest of it. How much of that is raised through property taxes?
probably
49 million. 49. Grants that come in for transportation or roads, well, that would go to the highway districts. But for other things that we do, so basically over half of the budget is fees and grants.
I see.
And we apply for those depending on the nature of it and what kind of strings are attached and whatnot. And those grants can cover public transportation, public safety, as in law enforcement, parks and waterways, in other words, for to maintain our docks, things of that nature. So those grants cut across a number of different segments.
I see. I see. So moving on to the next question, and thank you for your answer. Every person gets to vote for the commissioner's office or commissioners. Some people are property owners and others are renters, and some even live in apartments. Should homeowners get more access to services or just a bigger voice in general because they pay property taxes?
No. Very simple answer, because indirectly a renter is paying property taxes through the rent they pay. And by the way, I'm currently a renter. We sold our home in November. We were living in the city. We're now in the county, and we're renting our daughter's home, which is on 10 acres because she lives in Australia. So I'm a renter. So if I couldn't vote, I probably couldn't even run for office. So no, I do not agree with that. I think everybody should have the right to vote.
I agree with you. So moving on to another question, and thank you for that answer. About 10% of the county's income comes from federal grant money. Do you believe in using grants to fund county programs?
Yes. Depending on the nature of the grant and depending on the strings attached, we or our department heads evaluate every one of them. Those grants have targeted purposes. So for example, if there's a specific grant for law enforcement, and let's say that particular grant has to do with the purchase of weapons, for example, it has to be used for that purpose. So before a particular department head or segment applies for that grant, they make a judgment as to whether or not, number one, they need it, and number two, they can live with the conditions that go with it. And we have grants for, as I mentioned a few of them earlier, take the airport. The airport runways have to be reconfigured because at the present time, 2 of the runways are crossing. And that deemed somewhat unsafe, they have to be decoupled, okay? much of that money is going to come from the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, which incidentally reports to the Department of Transportation. Well, they're going to evaluate the plan. They're going to say, okay, the plan is a good one. Here's your money. And typically when we get those grants, there is some level of match that we have to provide. So in the typical situation, a grant may provide for, let's say, 93% of the financing for a particular project, and we come up with the other 7%. And sometimes the state chips in. So the state may chip in 4 or 5%, we're just coming up with 2 or 3. And sometimes our percentage is what we call in kind, meaning it's the labor that we provide that actually meets the match, so we're not necessarily expending any funds.
I see. I see.
So
Thank
some
you.
people have a philosophical issue with federal money. I do not. Depends on the situation and depends on the conditions.
So thank you for your answer.
You're very welcome.
So the last question in this topic of taxes is the county fair is separate from Kootenai County, but they do provide some funding. Do you think that is appropriate, and why or why not?
You mean, is it appropriate for the county to provide some level of funding?
No, I think that's what they were asking.
Okay. I don't necessarily have a problem with us providing the funding. I think the fair is somewhat self-sufficient, but it's so popular that I think if we were to attempt to cut the funding, we'd have to probably explain it. And so if you look at public sentiment, it's almost overwhelmingly in support of the county providing some level of funding.
So
I don't have an issue with it. Typically, they'll ask for more than we provide. I think last year, don't quote me, I don't have it in front of me, but I think we provided, I think it was 70 or 75,000. And typically they will ask for more than that. We typically don't always provide it. There have been years in the past where our prior board has provided much more than that, but I think they've been doing such a good job of raising their own funds. Now they are getting ready to embark on a major facility study, which could be quite costly, and they're asking for more money this year. But at this point, we're early on in the budget cycle, so I don't know whether or not that's going to happen. But
So
there's a lot of support for the fair.
So here's my question. Can anyone ask for money from you guys if you're a business?
So aside from the actual county functions, we have what we call community partners, such as, let's say, the senior centers, or Economic Development Corp, or the Guardians for people that are somewhat organizations. It's actually not as high as you might think. Some of them are as low as $2,500. One, for example, the University of Idaho Extension, that's up near maybe 650 or 700,000. Economic Development Corp, about 50. So we do provide, although U of I Extension, I think is somewhat mandated, but yes, anybody can come to us, and many do.
So
We take it on a case-by-case basis.
So if you would, what's the weirdest thing that someone has come in for, like to get money for?
The weirdest. I don't know that anyone is weird. That's a tough one. We've had a request within the area of historic preservation, if you will, to provide up to $1.5 million. And we're providing more like, you ready?
Yeah.
5,000. Now, the individual who requested this went to the statute and calculated how much we could potentially provide. And he's not wrong, but it's not going to happen. Because if we did that, we would probably have a lynch mob waiting for us outside. And so that's not going to happen. It's not that it's not a good idea. And I think it had to do more with museums, but historic preservation in general, which we do support. But that, if you want to call that weird, I wouldn't call it weird, but something that is almost impossible for us.
Yeah, I see. So, on the next topic, which is just being a leader or just being a boss,
Mhm.
the first question is, employee pay has been a common topic for Kootenai County citizens and just employees. How do you feel about employee pay at the county currently?
Okay, so this, in the fiscal year that we're currently in, which is fiscal year 20, um, the money that we raised was, I think I mentioned 1.4 million in taxation, and then there's also another ingredient called new growth. And those are the properties that are coming online that are just been completed, and so we're able to collect the taxes for those. So the total increase is about, if you look at it, it's 1.4 plus new growth at 1.2, 2.6 million, of which approximately 1.7 was used for increases, of which just under 1 million went to law enforcement. Here's the deal. When we lose patrol deputies, it costs us about $100,000 to train a new one. That means that's the cost of sending them to the training, which is 4 months, okay? And then to get them up to speed, which is probably another 5 to 6 months before they're fully capable of patrolling on their own. We can't afford to be spending $100,000 to hire and train a new deputy every time we lose one. So that was really the major focus. Now, at the same time, we had other employees that were underpaid. Now, did everybody get an increase? Pretty much everybody did. But when you look at the average increase that we gave in this fiscal year, it's just a little bit over 3%.
Mm.
So it really wasn't very high at all. Probably the highest increase given, which was one of the people that was most underpaid, was about 18%. Most of the people got 2%. Patrol deputies got 8%. And when we had the study, when the study was conducted, it was conducted by an independent third party. It was agreed to by all the elected officials. And so it was truly objective. And so we did the best we could. Obviously, we couldn't do as much as we needed to, but at least we made an effort to correct what needed to be corrected. And I can tell you that when you're in a labor shortage and you lose qualified and talented and experienced people, they're very hard to replace, because then we find ourselves potentially having to pay more than the individual we just lost. I'll give you an example. We lost this was a few years ago, we lost a planner, a senior planner. We lost one to the Department of Transportation in Spokane. He got $11,000 more per year. We lost another planner to the city of Rathdrum, $8,000 more.
Wow.
How many times can we do this?
Mm.
We've lost enforcers, code enforcers, because they can go and get more money, $5,000 or $7,000 more in Spokane. And somebody said, yeah, but they have to go to Spokane. Yeah, but the cost of housing is lower in Spokane than it is in Kootenai County. So we have to compete. We have to keep talented people. And that's just the reality that we find ourselves in.
Mm, I see. So thank you for your answer. And the next question is, commissioners have to work with many different kinds of people. What is
Mhm.
your management style, and why would it be a good fit to provide unified leadership for the county, or continue to?
Oh, okay. My leadership style, in a word, is participatory. I depend on and rely upon and frequently consult my subordinates. They are the experts. If I have somebody working in, let's say, our IT department, and we're having some technical or software challenges, why would I not take the advice of somebody that's been working the job for 12 or 15 years? If we're looking at land use issues, our director of community development, David Callahan, you go back far enough, has a degree in landscape architecture, has performed the same function in Texas and in Colorado, and he brings decades of experience. So why would I not rely on these people? If I can't rely on them, they shouldn't be here. So I will go, I consult them, and I take their input as part of my decision-making process. I grew up in the high-tech industry, and that industry was rather young when I got started, let's say back in the early to mid 1970s. And that industry was very avant-garde because it was almost, how do I put this? It was about as egalitarian as you could get. When I worked for Digital Equipment Corp, you may not remember them, but they started the mini computer revolution. That was the first breakaway from the legacy machines that IBM was creating. Digital Equipment Corp, we started the mini computer revolution that subsequently led to micros, to chips, et cetera, et cetera. And our CEO and founder, who happened to be an MIT engineer, said, no dedicated parking spots. This was back in Southern New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Okay, you come in late, you park in the back, you walk, and that goes for me as well. And that's the environment that I grew up in. And so I believe that people are equally valuable at whatever level. They should be consulted, and that's my style. I think there was a second part to your question.
Yes, the second part was it was why is this a good fit for the county compared to the other candidates?
Compared to what?
Compared to the other candidates, or just in general, why is your leadership?
Anybody attempting to come into this position without substantial budget and supervisory experience is doing themselves and the county a disservice. And that has happened, and it has happened repeatedly, and it's been happening again. This is a very different job to come into this position without having managed people, projects, budgets. You're getting it way in over your head. And what happens is then you lose perspective, and you really have to have a background in those three areas. And I do.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, it's an injustice to the county if individuals come in without that background. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in technology. It can be in finance. It can be in other fields. But the fact of the matter is, people need to be qualified coming into this position. And when people vote, they really should be looking at this position the way I described it. It's a job interview. It should not have anything to do, or minimally very little to do, with where the candidate fits in the political spectrum. Unfortunately, in this currently divided political climate, both nationally and locally that we're in, that may not happen.
Yeah, and I've seen that.
Challenge, let's put it that way.
That's an understatement. I've noticed that there can be a wonderful Democratic leader that is running for office, and he's the most qualified or she's the most qualified, but that doesn't matter because they're not on the Republican ticket. So moving on to the next question.
Go ahead.
So moving on to the next question is, who do you look up to? What community leaders would you look for? What community leaders would you look to for help if you were a commissioner, or if currently, who do you look up to for help?
Boy, that's a tough question because this is a rather lonely job. I can tell you that I have consulted and taken advice from Mayor Steve Widmeyer of Coeur d'Alene. When you say community leader, okay, gee, who else could I? There's a gentleman over whose organization, performs the electrical and mechanical inspections on building projects. His name is Larry Jeffers. I look up to Larry. I've known Larry for some time, and when my wife was on the planning commission, she had interaction. But I would say Mayor Widmeyer and Larry Jeffers. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. And Mr. Widmeyer, super nice guy, super nice fellow. And also, he's going to be on the podcast once the COVID-19 pandemic is over. So, so moving on to a next question, next topic, miscellaneous. I'll just call it that. Okay. Speed round. In political races, we hear a lot about problems, but what is something you think the county already does well?
Oh, if I had to pick one,
Yeah.
solid waste. Our solid waste organization is arguably one of the best in the nation. I think we do exceptionally well. And not only that, imagine this. We lowered, or they did, I should have to give the people the credit, operating under Director Kathy Mayer and our finance director, Lorene Chaffin. They lowered the solid waste fee from $93 per parcel or per property to $87. And even though they did that, you can take 1 ton of garbage every day to the dump. And one of our former recreational directors, Duck Eastwood, said that he's actually visited other solid waste organizations around the country and concluded that we are probably one of the best. Now, I haven't really investigated that to any depth, but it's a great compliment. And I think if I had to pick one organization, it would be that one. And we have others as well, but that one in particular shines.
And thank you for your answer. And because this is the speed round, I'm not going to be asking any, questions like that. But next question. How do you plan on campaigning with this pandemic going around?
Essentially, everything we do has to be by mail, social media, essentially, and mostly mail. The mailers that we each provide, letters to the editor. We're somewhat hampered in a normal campaign. We might have forums or debates, which are really helpful because you get to see the candidates face to face, so to speak, and candidates get to respond to and rebut one another. So that's missing in this campaign. So we need to rely more and more on, if you want to call it, almost non-traditional, although those have become traditional, but we have to learn to deal without the forums.
I see. So this is just an ongoing COVID-19 discussion. You are commissioner today. So as commissioner, how are you dealing with the governor's order, past tense, because it's up, but how were you dealing with it?
Okay, so what I try to tell people is, look, we are all under authority, and I don't worship at the altar of defiance. I might not agree with the governor's order. It turns out that I did agree with the extension from the 15th to the 30th. And I understand why, because he's collecting advice, if you will, from epidemiologists, from experts in the field. And by the way, President Trump is doing the same. He's even advocated for a phased-in approach. So we've had cases, people have written us, some have asked us to stand up to the governor and countermand his order. And I can tell you that we do not have the authority to do that. And that tends to be my response to folks who want us to do that. Now, we're currently in phase 1 of the recovery. And, there are certain situations that are in place, like meetings that we shouldn't be promoted that are more than 10 people. Phase 2 goes on to another. To expand, or to expand the recovery, and then phase 3 even more so. My position is this: irrespective of where I stand on the governor's order, I have to obey. And some people say, well, it's an order, it's not the law. I'm sorry, I'm not making that distinction. The fact of the matter is, either we're going to treat it and respect the rule of law, or at least the spirit of the law, or we break down as a society. And frankly, I'm not an anarchist. So that's the way I look at it. And by the way, we're maintaining social distancing, and it's worked. We're flattening the curve, not just here, but in other places in the country, because people have practiced social distancing. Now, there are other states and locales where COVID-19 is still on the rise. So it'll vary from place to place. I think we're on our road to recovery here. I support it, and I'll do what I can to help that along.
Thank you for answering my question. Well, that was the Kinda Opinion podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank you for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for your time, Luke. Thank you for doing this. You're well ahead of your chronological age, and I hope one day I'm going to be listening to you on TV.
Well, thank you guys.
Doing this.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys for listening to the Opinionated podcast. And until next time, bye.
Treat me this way.